Welcome to the Connect Your Health to Life coaching podcast. I'm your host, Seth Lusk. I'm a master certified life coach and published author with a decade-long background working in the health, wellness, and fitness industry as a personal trainer, nutrition specialist, and life coach. If you're anything like me or the clients that I work with, then you might be struggling with some confidence issues or struggling with feeling like you're not living your most fulfilling or authentic life. You may be trying to figure out why you have these amazing desires for what your most fulfilling life would look like, but you can't seem to create consistent action in your life to reflect those desires. So join me as we dive in deep on what it means to truly live a fulfilled and authentic life from the inside out. We're going to look from the perspective of an empowered mindset and uncover some of the reasons why you might be what's holding yourself back from living that most fulfilling life. But don't worry, this isn't about blame, guilt, or shame. This is about empowering you to see. I'm going to break through some of the biggest illusions and myths that we've all been taught to believe along the way. And I'm so excited to have you with me on this journey. So my only question for you is, are you ready to start living your most fulfilling life once and for all? Then let's get started, shall we? Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. For those of you listening in for the first time, welcome. You picked an interesting episode to join in on, as I say every week, but I really mean it every week. So this week is super interesting because it's a topic that I talk about all of the time. And why is it interesting? Because this time I'm going to talk about it directly instead of talking about it as sort of like a side note or a byproduct of what I'm talking about in the podcast. And today we're talking about comparison. And I think this is so important for us to look at for many reasons. And we'll get into that here in a minute. But first of all, I want to say, just so you know, if you find this topic interesting, in a few weeks, I'm actually having another special guest on. She's never been on my podcast before, and I'm super excited to have her. And we're also going to be addressing the topic of comparison from a slightly different perspective. And when we talk about comparison, that's just it. We could approach the topic of comparison from so many different angles. And there's so much there just in the topic of comparison that we could talk about as far as how we can empower ourselves and disempower ourselves with comparison. And this past week, I asked several of my friends, what would you like for me to talk about on the podcast next week? Because, I've got a list of topics about a mile long that I could talk about. And sometimes I just like to check in with my audience and friends and see like, hey, what's relevant for you guys that I talk about? And comparison came up. And while I've talked about comparison so many times before, especially in the episode where I talk about common fears that we have as humans and what to do with them and how fear is our friend, I talked about comparison there, as well as in several other episodes that I'm sure I've brought up comparison. But this week, I want to talk about comparison directly. And I want to talk about the act of comparison and what it is that's actually causing us to suffer and struggle with this concept of comparison. So let's start off by defining even what comparison is, because I think so many people are talking about comparison, but we might not even be clear on what exactly comparison in and of itself is. So comparison is simply a consideration of the similarities and dissimilarities between two things or two people. It's an examination between two or more objects or phenomenon to establish similarities and dissimilarities. So I want to start off by saying this right here, because we all always talk about like we shouldn't compare. You can't compare these two things. And the truth of the matter is we can compare. And the truth of the matter is that the act of comparison itself isn't a problem. It's not what's creating this issue that we see in our modern society that's affecting our mental health, emotional health, and the way that we treat each other. Comparison is not the problem, but we hear it all the time about how comparison is harming us, especially the younger generation who's grown up with social media being like just a part of life. Like that's what they grew up around. And because of this, they have large numbers of people and their lives that are available to them to constantly compare themselves to. And I also talk about the destructive nature of comparison culture all of the time, but I want to be clear about this today, and I want to clear this up. What exactly is destructive here? Because the act of comparison itself is not the issue, and it's not what's destructive. Comparison is something that we actually don't want to go away. And the reason why is because comparison allows us to distinguish differences. And this stems from survival mechanisms that we actually want to be able to exist. But here we have again another example of a survival mechanism that in our modern age, without awareness of it and what it's trying to accomplish, and without awareness of our power over it, well, it becomes destructive again. But the truth of the matter is we don't want comparison to go away. We want to be able to see similarities and dissimilarities. That is important for us in our human experience. But where it becomes destructive is not the comparison itself. It's not the consideration or the examination of two objects to establish similarities or dissimilarities. This is not the destructive nature. Because what it is the reason why we are comparing. And therefore, what we do with that comparison that ends up hurting us. Not the fact that our brain is wired to compare and therefore we compare. Some of the reasons why we might compare that could end or can end in destructive comparison would be, and this is again, if we're not aware of them, these reasons why, then the reasons why we're comparing can make comparison destructive because of what we'll do with it afterwards. And we'll get to that here in a minute. But some of these reasons why could be wanting to validate or prove our own worth through comparison. Or wanting to, see that we're not worthy, trying to prove our own unworthiness. Another reason would be wanting to fit in. And then another reason is a fear of missing out or many other different fears that we might have. And therefore, we show up and we compare from that space of fear. And these reasons why, if we're not aware of the reason why we're comparing, can lead to us taking action from that comparison that actually has a very destructive nature. I see people on social media looking at other people, influencers, celebrities, or even just friends on social media, and observing what is going on in this other person's life, and then comparing. And what I want to say is, first of all, I want you to think about this, what we're doing here. When it comes to social media, I want you to think about your own experience with social media. And what I mean by that is I want you to think about when you're making posts on social media. I want you to think about the amount of time that it takes you to make a post. I'm talking about from the idea of the fact that I want to make a post. And then formulating the idea of how you want to make the post. To get that post perfect, a short video or a picture, and then a caption for it. And I want you to think about the amount of time you spend preparing that post and how that amount of time and what you're doing during that time is not actually caught in the post itself. Then I want you to think about all of the time you spent before preparing for and creating that post in your day. I want you to think of all of that time and that is not in the post as well. Then I want you to think about all of the time in your day after the post is up, where you still exist, and there is this life that you're in, that you're living, that is not captured on the camera, not captured in the post. I want you to think about the difference in the things happening before and after the post in your day versus the content that is actually in your post. If you want to compare something, compare that right there. That's interesting to compare. Because what I want you to begin to notice is that when we talk about comparison in relation to social media, and that's not the only place in which we compare, but when we talk about it in this realm, what I want you to begin to notice is that the things that people are posting, quote unquote, about their life on social media is not their life. It's this very narrowed down, zoomed in, filtered, planned out, edited, and timed window of what they want to present about their life. And I think oftentimes we forget this. And this doesn't mean that it's a bad thing or that people need to stop posting online. This isn't what I'm saying. Or that we need to look at the post and be like, oh, that's just stupid. It's not representative of real life and just dismiss it. That's not what I'm saying either. I think we just need to bring our awareness back to the fact of what posts on social media actually are before we begin comparing our lives to other people's lives through the lens of social media. We need that awareness when we're doing this. I think we've often forgotten that social media isn't the reality of a person's life. It is a part of a person's life, and it's a huge part of a lot of people's lives. I know for me, myself, as an entrepreneur, social media is a huge part of my life. I use it to get information out to people. I use it to advertise. I use it to get information about what it is that's relevant for my audience to talk with them about. So social media is a huge part of my life, but it's only one part. And when I'm putting social things on social media, I want you all to realize that it is very controlled. What I'm putting on social media is very thought out. It's very planned. Same with other people. What people put on social media is a controlled attempt to showcase the reality in a way that we hope is perceived by others to be. And it becomes so easy for us to think that this is the case for us, but that what other people post is actually their reality. And we forget this double standard actually exists, and we forget that what we're observing and comparing on social media is not this person's actual life. I think that it is important that we always come back to this awareness when we find ourselves in this position of comparing through the lens of social media. It's very important that we bring it back to that awareness before we go about the comparison and doing anything with that comparison. Not to diminish the other person's life or their effort to showcase it or celebrate it. That's not what we're trying to do here either. But more so for the reason that why social media and comparison on social media can become so damaging when we forget this. And when we forget this, and then we come up after comparison, and we start to apply very falsely objective statements about the comparison that we're making through the lens of social media, such as which life or which person is better or worse than the other. And we're going to talk about this a bit more in a little bit, but before I do, comparison culture doesn't stop with social media. It doesn't stop with celebrities. We spend a lot of time on social media these days. And a ton of unrealistic judgments about comparison from the setting take place in our daily lives. That I think we can begin to see. But there is another place where this is spilling over from social media into our everyday life. And social media just makes it easier for us to make these falsely objective judgments even more unattached from the reality of life. And to make those judgments seem more factual to us, because the window through which we're able to make these judgments on social media is extremely narrow. And our brain has to fill in a large amount of blanks with its imagination and negativity bias and personal emotional woundings and experiences. And this then spills over into our life, in our person-to-person interactions, and can cause us to do the same thing. The other area that we want to look at that this is leaking over from is the amount of comparison and then following the following falsely objective judgments that we make with people in person on a daily basis. And we believe that these falsely objective judgments are true. And we forget that even there, that our window in which we are looking at our life and the other person's life is still very narrow. Have you ever stopped to pay attention to this? I think that it becomes easy for us to recognize the behavior on social media because the judgments are so far-fetched due to we can see that it's a smaller window of input that we have into the other person's life. It's maybe easier for us to step back from that and to see just how unrealistic and destructive these judgments can be when we see that we're doing it through such a tiny window that is not indicative of the person's actual life. And we can see why maybe we want to stop doing this. And we recognize that because of the internet, if we do this, we could theoretically be doing this with billions of people's lives. And that we really don't know anything other than the small filtered, scripted, planned out snippets that we see through social media and the internet. And in being able to see this, I think we have taken our focus away from a more subtle and even more dangerous zone of comparison and therefore falsely objective judgments taking place in our lives. And that is with the people that we interact with in person in our daily lives, that we spend actual time with in person. And why do I say that this is even more dangerous? And it has to do with how our brains work. Because it's easy for us to see on social media and through the internet how that quote unquote reality is very scripted, very filtered, very not indicative of real life. But we forget that the same is actually happening in person. Remember me telling you about negativity bias? And that our brain collects evidence for its beliefs? We've talked about this several times before. And that as the evidence is collected, it signals to other parts of our brains what to look for and focus on to shape our reality and the lens that we will look at the world through. This is why this area of comparison and judgment is also and is maybe even more dangerous for us. Because our brains feel even more justified in believing that these comparisons and then following falsely objective judgments are actually truthful facts, instead of seeing them as being very falsely objective statements based in very subjective experience through lenses of observation that have been shaped by our negativity bias and our previous unaware experiences in life. And we're doing this with very small amounts of data in comparison to the amount of data that actually exists to know the full truth about what we are observing and then making these judgments about. So maybe before I continue, it's important to clarify something that I keep saying here. And what I mean by this when I say observations are subjective, and that we compare people and lives through this subjective experience of observation. And then the problem is that we're making very falsely objective judgments about that subjective observation experience. And I think this is going to clear up what I'm talking about here when I talk about the fact that our lenses that we see the world through are so subjective and minute. So let's talk about this here. Observation is subjective for many reasons. First of all, let's define subjective. So subjective means that it is characteristic of belonging to reality as perceived rather than independent of the mind. So what that means is that it is something belonging to reality, but we're looking at it as how it is perceived rather than independent of having a mind. So in other words, it means we have a mind involved. And why is that important? Well, this is important to understand because our mind perceives reality, but doesn't actually experience all of reality. Reality consists of billions upon billions upon billions upon billions, like more numbers than you can even comprehend, pieces of information that are available at every moment in time that make up what is actually reality. This vast amount of information is, let's just put it simply here, way too much for a brain to process moment to moment. So the body is able to perceive somewhere around 11 million pieces of information. Out of those billions upon billions upon billions upon billions of pieces of information, it's able to perceive somewhere around 11 million pieces of information at any moment in time, coming from the environment. And I want you to already understand this is like less than, I don't even know, like 0.005% of reality that the body is actually experiencing with these 11 million pieces of information. So even with these 11 million pieces of information, we have such a small fraction of 1%, not even 1%, a small fraction of 1% of reality being actually taken in by the body. And then sends that to the brain about the environment around it. And then the brain, being an organ of survival, it formulates a strategy to optimize its chances to survive. And one of those strategies is that it only chooses a certain amount of pieces of information to perceive based on what it can process. And it does that. It chooses those pieces of information based on what our reticular activating system tells it to perceive is important for us, which is based in our own previous judgments, based on experience, based on that small lens of information that the brain can take in. But here's what's crazy. It's somewhere around 40 to 60 pieces of information at any moment in time or any second that the brain is actually able to process. So we have billions upon billions upon billions upon billions upon billions upon billions, I can't even say that enough times, of pieces of information that are available. Out of that, 11 million pieces of that information actually come into the body and are perceived by the body. So we already have this tiny fraction of even 1% of reality coming in through the body. And then out of that, only 40 to 60 pieces of information are actually processed by the conscious brain. Think about that. Your consciously perceived experience of the world is somewhere around 0.0000000004% of actual reality. And that's if we actually look at there only being 1 billion pieces of information available. And out of that, we have 11 million pieces that come in. And out of that, 40 to 60 pieces of information are processed by the brain. So if it was only 1 billion pieces of information available, what we're actually perceiving consciously as our reality is 0.00000004% of reality. I need you to think about that there, okay? That means a decimal point with 8 zeros before we get to a 4. So 0.00000004% of reality is what we actually consciously perceive and process through the conscious brain. And that is only if we take the amount of information that is actually available to us and narrow it down to 1 billion. 1 billion pieces of information. But there are actually billions upon billions upon billions of pieces of information available to us at any moment in time. I want you to think about the tiny amount of information in comparison to what is available that we are actually perceiving. And then I want you to think about the fact that that's actually a lot of information to perceive. It is. So this isn't like this hopeless thing. The point of this is, what you and I perceive as being reality is such a tiny, tiny, tiny portion of information that makes up reality. And this information is coming in and being filtered through our negativity bias, our subjective history of evidence from previous experience and how we interpreted that. So what this means, my friends, is that we are so intelligent. We have a computer between our ears that processes more information than you can even fathom. And then outside of that, there is this staggering amount of information that's like beyond comprehension for us, that is available for us to comprehend. However, in comparison to that amount of information that is reality, what we can actually process, our ignorance to everything, is staggering. And I know that some of you might be freaking out right now and thinking, oh my God, this is horrible. And I get that. I want us to take a different approach here, though. You see, we put so much pressure on ourselves to take ourselves so seriously and to quote unquote get it right. Or we feel stuck in what we believe is right. My friends, take the pressure off. We cannot get it right. We can't. And what we believe is right, it is okay to change it. It is okay to realize that there is information that we did not have when we created this idea that what we believe is right, and to release our beliefs to form new ones. It doesn't make us crazy. It doesn't make us irresponsible or ignorant or failed or stupid. It makes us human, and it makes reality as vast as it actually is. Take the pressure off. Okay? Now back to comparison and that subjective observation. The lives and the people that we observe around us, our observation of them is not reality. It's not our reality. It's not theirs. That is why I need you to realize how subjective that observation is. When we view people through social media, it's quite obvious for us, I think. Some of us maybe not so much, and if it's not so obvious for you, let's talk about that. But if it is, I think where we forget just how subjective our interpretation of our observations of other people is this very limited interpretation of reality. Through the limitation of experience and interpretation through having a brain. This is so important for us to remember here in a world where comparison and judgment have become the source of so much suffering as a species. And it's not because of comparison in and of itself. It's what we do it with it and why we're doing it. And one of the ways in which this suffering manifests itself is in how we falsely make these statements as if they're objective about people and their lives, and ourselves and our lives, and about which is better or worse, which is more or less worthy or valuable. And when we do this with our lives in comparison to others, or with other lives in comparison to others, this suffering is felt deeply within ourselves. But many of us feel like we can't stop doing it to ourselves. And I'm here to offer that we can, but we have to do this by first learning to release the judgments, and that the judgments are actually the part that's creating the suffering, not the comparison. And that we can release these judgments because they are so subjective, they are not true. So now that we see just how subjective our interpretation and experience to create these judgments, how subjective that is, I want to talk about what I mean when I talk about these judgments being falsely objective. The judgments are falsely objective because of many reasons that we just talked about. Because objective means, the definition of objective means of relating to or being an object or phenomenon or condition in the realm of sensible experience that is independent of individual thought and perceptible by all observers. It also means having reality independent of the mind. Okay? So objective literally means no mind. Objective literally means it is independent of individual thought and is perceptible by all observers. And what this means is that objective is something that is separate from the reality of the mind's ability to perceive. What is interesting here is that we're not actually able to perceive this. Objectivity is not something that the human mind is actually truly 100% capable of. We as humans try to get as close to it as possible, and we call that objectivity. But here's the thing, as we learn more and more about reality, we alter that objectivity. So I need you to understand that even what we call objectivity, because so many people agree on it, isn't actually objectivity. We learn more and more about reality all the time, and we alter that objectivity to match what we learn that we're actually perceiving as we learn. And that's not bad. That's good. We need to recognize that this is a normal process that we're always going to be going through, and that is okay. 100% complete objectivity is just not possible for the human mind and how it experiences life. This is so important and also liberating for us to recognize. Right here is the fact that you need to know to release you from the responsibility of quote unquote getting it right. Because no matter how right you get it, it's not ever going to be objectively right. It's only right according to some human standards that are agreed upon by some humans according to what they know about how to experience and interpret their experience of life through that lens of experience that we just talked about, which is the billions upon billions upon billions of pieces of information coming in through 11 million pieces of information and being narrowed down to about 40 to 60. Okay? And we feel comfortable believing this agreed upon experience as long as it serves us. And that's good. That's how we survive in this life. That's how we make it as a species. That's how we learn and we grow. But it never fails when we have that objectivity. Eventually, someone's going to find flaws in that objectivity. And that doesn't mean that we were bad or wrong or evil people before for not seeing it. This is just how human reality works. We need that sort of lens of objectivity, quote unquote, to sort of feel comfortable enough in to explore outside of it. But at the same time, we need to recognize that that objectivity is falsely objective. Because it never fails. What happens is someone will find a flaw in that common experience and then begin to explore that flaw and find more about reality than is commonly accepted or that people are socially comfortable with knowing and seeing about life. And then these people go about amounting evidence that what they are discovering is different from the agreed upon reality and is in fact objectively true. And they do this by creating and collecting evidence of its truth, and then going about getting enough people to see and agree upon this evidence until what is believed to be true or possible in reality is agreed upon again and includes this newly discovered information. Throughout the course of human history, this has been what has allowed us to evolve and grow as a species. And my friends, I think we take ourselves too seriously in thinking that we know so many things, and that science is about what we know. Science is about what we are discovering. Science is about what we're exploring, and therefore it's never wrong, but it's also never 100% right. But science is about constantly exploring. And what we want are these rigid rules to live by. In comes religion. Because we want that, like, no, this is what is objectively right, this is what we will live by, this is the truth, end of story. We want that because we think it somehow keeps us safe. We think it somehow makes life better and more certain. But actually what it does is it stunts our ability to see that our reality is subjective. It's not the truth. It's not objective. And there's always room to find more truth. There's always room to explore. There's always room to find the fallacies and the falseness in what we believe to be true. And in doing so, this is how inventions come about. Inventions that just 100 years ago would have been thought to be something from fairy tales. But now we look at them and they're just very much a part of our everyday life. Think things like cars. Think things like now we're looking at electric cars. We're actually considering, could there be life on Mars? And we have Elon Musk kind of trying to lead that way into exploring. My friends, like 100 years ago, that would have been considered absurd, like to even consider that idea. And we're actually considering the potential of it now. We now have cars we're able to drive these large distances. We're able to fly. That just hundreds of years ago, that was not possible. Or, yeah, think about that. We thought that was not possible. And now it's a part of our everyday life. Hundreds of years ago, objectively speaking, quote unquote, they thought that was not possible. My friends, I'm telling you this to point out that we as humans are not objective. We cannot be 100% objective as long as we have a mind and a human body through which we experience life. The information we take in is extremely limited. And then the interpretation of that information is even more limited. And then our experience through that limited interpretation reinforces more limitations in how we will experience and interpret input of stimulus and information later in life. So what I need you to grasp from this, my friends, is that what you are perceiving as being your reality, that you are limiting yourself by, that you are saying, no, that's not possible. I can't do that. I want you to consider the minuteness of that reality that you're living in. And that there is so much more out there to explore that could be true for you, that could unlock your potential and your exploration into what is real for you, not what you've been taught to have to believe is real for you. So what does this have to do with comparison? Oftentimes when we compare two people in two lives, two objects, two phenomenon, our brain convinces us to then use the experience of these two objects and our consideration of the similarities and dissimilarities to then put that interpretation of experience through our old lenses of subjective experience that we just talked about, how minute and tiny and not objective they are, and then through that to create judgments about the objects or phenomenon that we are comparing. Meaning that either one is better or worse than the other, one is more worthy, one is more valuable. And when we do this, we do it with this false objectivity. We treat the judgments as if they are factual and objective. And this is where comparison becomes problematic and destructive, especially when the reason why we're comparing in the first place is to try and prove our worth through being better than someone else, or, proving that we're not worthy because we feel like we're not better than someone else. Or when it comes from the reason why being something to do with trying to fit in, because we think that's so important, because fitting in to someone else's falsely objective reality is going to be what makes us feel better about ourselves. When we're doing it because of that, or a fear of missing out, and then we show up and we create these falsely objective judgments, this is where this becomes problematic and destructive. And this is where we begin to create suffering through comparison. It's not the comparison itself, because comparison in and of itself is just about noticing similarities and dissimilarities. If we're doing that from a space of curiosity, if we're doing that from a space of, I'm already worthy enough, I'm already good enough, my life is already amazing, but I have all of this potential available to me. And when I compare my life to other people's lives, I can notice similarities and dissimilarities. What can I do with that? What potential can I unlock for myself and for others by exploring that? And what might be possible for me to open up for myself and therefore the rest of humanity? But instead, we're doing it through this lens of trying to feel like we're good enough, trying to compare ourselves to fit in, trying to, prove who's more worthy and less worthy. And when we're doing it through that lens, it becomes this very destructive process in which, in the end, what we're trying to do is then on the other side come out with these falsely objective statements about whose life and who or which object, which phenomenon is better or worse than the other. And we do this with so much confidence, and then create these false realities for ourselves about other people or other people's lives being better or worse than others or our own. And then we bring it home and create suffering for ourselves when we do this with someone else in comparison to our own life. Whether we end up judging with this false objectivity that our own life is better or worse than another. Either way, we create suffering for ourselves. And we reinforce it in other people. And this is a deep conversation that we could get into, but maybe we save that for another time. For now, just know this, that this is the source of suffering and the problems that we see when it comes to comparison. It's not about noticing similarities and dissimilarities. It is believing that our subjective experience of those and interpretation of those is then objective, and then using that information to judge with objectivity because we're coming from that fear of not being good enough. We're coming from that fear of not fitting in and not being acceptable, not being lovable enough, not being worthy enough. So the answer is not to stop comparing. Comparison is something that the brain is going to do, and it is a healthy survival mechanism for the brain, and it's designed to do so, and it's something that we want to do because it causes us to be curious about life when we come from a space of abundance and worthiness, unconditional worthiness. Asking the brain to stop comparing would be like asking it to stop giving you hunger signals just because you don't know how to interpret those hunger signals and eat the kinds of foods and the amounts of them that serve your body and your genuine wants to your health. The same applies here. We don't want to ask the brain to stop comparing just because we're not looking at where that comparison is coming from and what we're doing with it. We don't want to ask the brain to stop comparing simply because we're unaware of what the brain is doing and why, or just because we're unaware of how we can use the strategy of the brain to actually work for us and help us to become more curious about life, not falsely objectify and judge it. We have to remember that the brain is a tool that we get to use. Remember that. I say it over and over again. And when we don't use it, it will use us. And it has this negativity bias. It has this, because of this negativity bias, to focus on fears. And within those fears lies that fear that we're not good enough. And when we couple that with the brain's desire to compare, what we end up on the other side with is a bunch of falsely objectified judgments about the worthiness of ourself and other people in comparison. So something that I've begun to do when I notice myself drawing these objective judgments from comparison is to first pause and just recognize what I'm doing and laugh about it a little bit. Like, what's actually going on here? Like, it's not that serious. It's my brain doing something and me letting it use me, and I can stop and laugh about it for a second and be like, okay, all right, so there's some comparison going on here, and I'm wanting to take it here. So I can pause for a second and realize I don't have to go that route. And then I offer myself love, compassion, and patience because I am human. That's going to be part of my experience, but I get to choose what I do with it. Then I remind myself that the judgments that I'm wanting to make, the judgments I'm wanting to make in that situation are coming from extremely subjective lenses of my own experience. So neither I nor the person neither my life or the life that I'm observing is objectively better or worse than my own, I can release the desire to go that route with my judgments. Then what I can do is I go about with some journaling, and I'll look at this person or life that I'm comparing mine to, and I'll do it with curiosity instead. And I will begin to think about and write about the things that I'm observing in their life that I like, and that I think maybe I want some more of that in my life for some reason. What is it that I'm actually looking at here that I want more of, and why? Why do I want that? What is important about this for me? And after I'll look at this writing that I just did, and the things I believe I want in my life, that this other person has, that I'm observing, and I will think about how this ties back to my values and my sensitivities, and why I feel like that is an important thing to look at. Why maybe I want more of that in my life. Many times in this process, what I find is that the thing that I want in my life, or the thing that I'm observing in their life that I think I want, is actually not the thing itself. It is a feeling that I believe this other person has because of this thing that they have in their life. So for instance, sometimes what I find is that there is a character strength that I'm observing that I wish to have more in my life. And these are all things that I have the ability to align with my purpose, my values, my sensitivities, my authentic path in life, and then create more of it in my life in an empowered way, not because I'm not good enough, but because I'm able to see through a reflection of another person potential that I haven't unlocked yet. Maybe an area of my life where I have a strength that I'm not strengthening, that I'm not working on, and I'm noticing it in another person's life and being like, what would happen if I strengthened that too? What would my life look like if I strengthened that too? So what is actually happening here is simply my own values and sensitivities viewing a reflection of themselves in another person's life and reminding me that I have potential to own more of my power within myself and to express more of my true self and my values in my own life, and to sharpen character strengths within myself that will help me show up in my life in a more authentic and truer way, that will help me to express more of those values in my own life. So what may appear at first that I think is this other person's life being better than mine, and maybe I feel jealous, actually turns out to be an opportunity for me to examine my own life when I come from a space of I'm already good enough. When I come from a space of curiosity, this becomes an opportunity for me to examine my own life and look at the ways in my life in which I'm limiting myself and saying, you can't go any further there. That's as far as you can go. And then I look at someone else expressing more of a character strength in their life and I think, what would happen if I strengthened that skill actually? Why do I believe that my limit is there? Why do I believe that my life stops here and that I can't go further with strengthening that skill? That I can't express more of this value in my life in other ways? That I can't explore different ways in life in which I can express more of this value? So, for instance, I may look at a person's life that they have more money than me, and then they go on more vacations than me. And I may feel some jealousy. I may look at their life and think their life is better than mine. But after taking a step back, journaling, and bringing it back to my core values and sensitivities, my true desires in life, what it would turn out to be is that I'm observing an expression of freedom. And freedom is important to me. And my higher self is reminding me that creating more of this in my life is important to me. And I can prioritize developing this and expressing more of this in my life because what I'm actually seeing in this person's life is I think more freedom. And I want more of that in my life. And then I go back to the drawing board of how I can create more freedom in my life. So instead of it being about jealousy, instead of it being about their life being better than mine, it is about me awakening myself to the fact that I can express more freedom in my life if I want to. I have that ability. And maybe seeing this person's life and recognizing what I see or what I see reflected in their life as being freedom reminds me that that is important to me and to show up and find solutions to express more of that in my life. This is the practice that I've been honing and sharpening, and what I help many of my own clients hone and sharpen through many different journaling activities, through many different questioning activities, through many different showing up and exploring activities. But this is one of the the practices that I really have been honing and sharpening in my own life and in my clients' lives. And I find it to be very helpful in this area of comparison because it helps us step back from that comparison instead of sliding down that slippery slope of falsely objective judgments of someone else's life being better or worse or more worthy or less worthy than our own. I can bring it back to it being about curiosity and opportunity to explore. And what we can begin to do is release the responsibility of those judgments. Once we examine and once we see the fact or are aware of the fact that if we go down this path, the judgments we're going to be making aren't true anyways. And in the process of doing so, we put conditions on our own worth and other people's worth. And by putting conditions on other people's worth, those actually come back to conditions on our own worth. And when we can see that, we can hit pause. And we can go back to the desire to compare and choose to use it in a constructive way of opportunity and curiosity versus one of falsely objective judgment and conditional worthiness on ourselves and other people. What I want you to take from today is that when we compare and then use the experience of comparison to make these falsely objective judgments about our own life, we create damage. We put conditions on our own worthiness through other people and directly on ourselves. And this is where the suffering we are seeing is coming from. It's not coming from comparison itself. It's not coming from comparison, which is the noticing of similarities and dissimilarities. I also want you to take away from today that the first step towards healing that damage is the recognition that these judgments we are making only feel objective. And we can go back and look at those judgments that we've been living in for so long and realize just how subjective they are and begin the process of healing and releasing them. And we want to begin releasing them and releasing this idea of objectivity that surrounds them. We can start using this experience of comparison in a way that empowers us through curiosity and opportunity. An opportunity to learn and evolve and grow and sharpen and strengthen our own skills. And that through this, we remove conditions on our worth and other people's worth. I can sharpen any skill that I notice in another person, but I don't have to be more worthy. I don't have to be good enough. I feel the calling to, I feel the pull to, because I see someone else doing it, and I notice, hey, if it's possible for them, why am I limiting myself? Why am I holding myself captive here and saying that I can't go further with this? What ways can I stop limiting myself here? What beliefs do I have that are holding me back here from exploring that strength and sharpening it and strengthening it more for myself? We can turn it into that, as opposed to it being about putting conditions on our own worth and us not being good enough because we're not doing what this other person is doing or don't have what they have in their life. That's what we want to do here. We want to start using this experience to create more opportunity, to create more curiosity in the world, to create more possibility. And we start by remembering again how the body and brain take in, interpret, and process information. And from this very empowered position of recognizing this, and I know some of you may not feel like it's empowered, but it is, because once we recognize this, we have so much more freedom to look at our own beliefs and recognize just how subjective they are, and that they're a little bit more moldable than we've been believing, and that we actually have power here to decide what is our truth and what we want to be living out loud in our life based on our true experience, our true emotional experience, our true values and sensitivities in life. And to begin to recognize that there is so much more truth out there to be found when we start questioning those beliefs and exploring. There's so much more truth to be found where we've stopped looking because we believe that this is just how it is. This is just how life is. And that this person is just objectively better than us. Or we are objectively better than someone else here. And when we do that, we put conditions on other people's worth that comes back to ourselves because it's really being done out of fear. That we need to be better than someone to be good enough. So by seeing all of this, we also get to see that we're not bound to these falsely objective, quote-unquote, truths from these judgments that we've been making, that we felt stuck in or maybe captured by. We don't have to keep living in that experience of believing that someone else's life is better than our own, or that our life needs to be better than someone else's to prove its worth. I know that so many of us feel stuck in these loops of comparison where the end product is either you feeling not enough in comparison to someone else, or you feel the end product needs to be that you need to prove that your life is better than someone else. And you go about this very scarcity and fear-based path of trying to prove you're better than other people, to validate your own worth in this world. And that feels so, my friends, so draining. It's so draining to do that and try and go down this path. And this is why so many of us give up on our goals, because we don't even realize that the goal that we set is actually about trying to be better than other people, and that goal is based in our own conditional worth. And trying to work to prove our worth is just, my friends, exhausting and damaging. So my hope is that this episode today starts to, because there's so much more to discuss here, but I'm hoping that this episode starts to create some awareness for you of why this is happening. This suffering that we see or surrounding comparison. And then what direction we want to begin looking in from now on when we see this happening in our own life. I would also suggest that if this is something you're really struggling with, I want you to know that there are some deeper concepts at play here, having to do with your story about yourself and your worth and your self-image and your concept of your own empowerment. And these concepts are very personal to your life and your journey, and can't be discovered through a podcast, can't be talked about through a podcast. And working with a coach is a very helpful way to uncover those and find the path through them that is authentic for you, instead of subconsciously avoiding them and feeling stuck in them. Okay? Remember that comparison is not the problem here. If you feel overwhelmed in this loop of comparison and comparing, and then you find yourself creating these falsely objective judgments from those comparisons, then I would suggest doing something like taking a break from exposure to the stimulus that you find yourself being triggered to compare and then immediately judge. And during this time, I want you to look inward and reflect on your own life. What are your values and sensitivities? What are your true desires? Not based on what you can compare yourself out there to, based on what you think people will want to see in your life and what should be valuable in your life and what you should want to make yourself valuable. I want you to remember how subjective all of that is, and that you have your own experience. And that honoring those values and sensitivities is going to be your way to find what is truly important for you. And I want you to go about discovering that. And I want you to remember during this time how your views of your life and other people's lives are limited and subjective. And this isn't bad, because you can release them. And you can release yourself from the trap of your limiting beliefs that you've placed on yourself and what is possible for you based in that limited experience and that subjective judgment. And when you feel like you've established this clear vision of your worth, your purpose, your values, your sensitivities, then you can begin reintroducing the stimulus back in your life and pay attention to what happens around it and what you want to do with that comparison when it comes back. Oftentimes, I'm going to recommend working with a coach to discover these sensitivities, these values, and your purpose. To dig deep with the coach and find them and your path forward and how you're going to use them to create the life that you want. And then show back up in your life and pay attention to the areas where comparison comes up. And this time around, you can use that awareness and these strategies mentioned today to turn this comparison into an empowered act of compassion, inspiration, opportunity, and curiosity and creation. All right, my friends, this is what I want you to take from today. That's all I have for you today about comparison. There's so much more we can talk about. And as I said, I have a special guest coming up in a few weeks, and we're going to talk about comparison from a slightly different angle. And for those of you business owners out there or entrepreneurs out there, we're going to be talking about how comparison shows up in the business realm as well as with our health. So keep an eye out for that episode. But that's what I have for you today. I hope today's episode was helpful. I imagine that there are still many questions surrounding this, as there should be. Real life examples that you might be coming up with, some what ifs that you're still thinking of. What I want to encourage you to do is please reach out with those. Don't sit and fester with them and disempower yourself into believing that what we talked about today doesn't apply to you and you can't use it, or that you're stuck anyways. Reach out, ask your questions, share your examples where you feel like what we talked about today doesn't apply. I'm here for all of that, okay? I'm here for that, so reach out. I love you all so, so, so much. Okay? So get out there. Use your brains. Use your brains. Don't let them use you. Use your brain's power of comparison. Use it in an empowered, compassionate, and curious way. Release the responsibility of those falsely objective judgments and free yourself to see the world with this wildly open possibility that exists out there. Okay? And until we meet again here next week, my friends. Ciao. Hey, thank you for listening in this week. I hope you enjoyed the content of this episode. If you did, please subscribe or follow this podcast to receive the newest episodes every week as I bring them to you here on the Connect Your Health to Life coaching channel. Ratings, reviews, and comments are always appreciated. These allow me to know more of what my listeners would like in the podcast and allow for more people who may be searching for a podcast just like this one to find the Connect Your Health to Life coaching channel. If you would like more information about me and the work that I do with my clients one-on-one, then please visit my website at www.slch.ch. Again, that is www.slch.ch. You can also find me on social media on Instagram at SethLusk_coaching. Again, that is SethLusk_coaching. And on Facebook in my free Facebook group community called A Healthy Life Connection. We would love to have you in the group, and it's only 3 membership questions that you have to answer to join. And again, it's entirely free. And if you need any further information or just want to say hello, feel free to send me an email directly at slusk.health@slch.ch. Again, that is slusk.health@slch.ch. Thank you again so much for listening, and I look forward to our next time together. Ciao.